All right, can somebody just confirm for me that we are that you seeing this in presentation mode?
We
Yep.
are.
We are.
Awesome. All right. Well, without further ado, thank you everyone for spending a little bit of your day today on this webinar to learn a little bit about state wildlife action plans. I'm Mark Humpert. I'm with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I'm the Director of Conservation. And I've spent probably somewhere around 25 years either working at the state level or at AFWA, involved with either the development or implementation of state wildlife action plans. But it's just, to me, incredibly gratifying to see the evolution of these plans and the importance that these plans have become to conserving biodiversity in the country. And I also want to welcome Becky Gwen from Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, who's also been at this for almost a quarter of a century. And I'm gonna have her at the end of the PowerPoint slide make a few comments about being in the trenches of putting one of these state wildlife action plans together. So just a quick timeline. You know, the history of wildlife diversity funding goes back a long time. If you think about how many of the species that aren't necessarily hunted and fished benefited from Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson's Act. Pittman-Robertson Act passed in 1937, the Dingell-Johnson Act in 1950. But we really have a really debt of gratitude to hunters and anglers who pay for the excise taxes and the license fees. That has done a lot to contribute to conservation of many species of fish and wildlife. But we also know that not having targeted funds for wildlife diversity, or sometimes it's called non-game, it didn't really, it led to some, the lack of ability of conservationists to do some of the interventions needed. And, you know, the importance of biodiversity or non-game fish and wildlife to people, to our health, it was sort of, Aldo Leopold, you know, back in, well, 75 years ago, sort of talked about this land ethic that we need. And as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Sand County Outland Act, this really is forefront in my mind how long this idea of living in harmony with nature and our natural surroundings has been important. But you know, we often, you know, out of crisis is how we get policy, and some of the declines of species like bald eagles and peregrine falcons were seen in the 50s and 60s, and that resulted in the Endangered Species Act being enacted in 1973. And about that same time, even preceding that, states began creating their own Endangered Species Act, starting these really small non-game programs. And in the 70s, it was really about, you know, funding. There weren't many state legislatures that were able to provide funding to do work on non-game or wildlife diversity. And so the non-game tax checkoff was sort of one of the innovations that was started to allow citizens to voluntarily contribute to non-game through a tax checkoff. Conservation license plates and other sort of innovations or unique ways of raising money then took hold. And so in the 1970s, we started to see these non-game programs really start to take shape. In 1975, I always like to call out Wildlife Management Institute, put together a seminal report that really called for the need for conservation planning by states for non-game. It also recommended that Congress expand the excise tax from hunting, you know, shooting equipment, fishing equipment, to other products that outdoor recreationists use. So that was that first concept of sort of expanding the excise tax came out in that report in 1975. In 1980, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act was passed, which again sort of spoke to the need for states to develop comprehensive plans for fish and wildlife. I think there was about $5 million that was authorized for the program, never any monies appropriated. And so we went through this period, AFWA went through this period of frustration of working on the Hill, but not getting much success. So in the early 1990s, started the Wildlife Diversity Initiative. And Naomi Edelson, who some of you probably know, was hired by AFWA to come in and start this initiative, build a coalition, and to use all available tools to try to secure federal funding for wildlife diversity. And that she built a coalition that eventually grew to 6,500 organizations called the Teaming with Wildlife Coalition that really put this issue up in the forefront and was able to get some congressional action. In the late 1990s, former Congressman Don Young of Alaska became the champion and was more than willing to introduce legislation that would have expanded the excise tax to outdoor recreation products, things like binoculars and field guides, even recreational vehicles. But he said that, because of, headwinds from, sort of a resistance for new taxes, that it likely wasn't going to go very far. So Don Young teamed up with Mary Landrieu, former senator in Louisiana, that was really interested in taking some of the revenues from offshore drilling and dedicating them to conservation. And Don Young said, if you can put a wildlife title in the bill you're working on, you've got my support. And so Title III was added to the Conservation Reinvestment Act, which was $350 million for wildlife diversity, and specifically to create the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program, which is an amendment to the Pittman-Robertson Act. And that was really important because we wanted to show that the successes of the Pittman-Robertson Act, we just want to expand on that to benefit more species. One of the most successful conservation programs in the history of world conservation is the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts. And so the Conservation Reinvestment Act, Naomi brought the large and growing coalition of Teaming with Wildlife to bear, which really moved the legislation, Conservation Reinvestment Act, which I think there were 7 titles. It included full funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund and other things, coastal restoration. But that Title III for wildlife conservation is what was really what the Teaming with Wildlife Coalition was all about. Passed by 300 to maybe like 110 in the House of Representatives, but great bipartisan support. There were 62 senators in the Senate that wrote a letter and said, bring this to the floor, we support it, which if you follow politics, that's the type of margins you're looking for, veto-proof or filibuster-proof majority. Even had the administration supportive, but sort of at the 11th hour, appropriators said, well, just wait a minute, really don't want to give up that control. And so they didn't allow Conservation Reinvestment Act to get to the Senate floor, but sort of made this promise that we really like the wildlife title, and through appropriations, we'll get you to that $350 million over the course of 5 or 6 years. And we know that unfortunately didn't happen, but it did result. There was it was called CARE Light. There were 2 programs that were included in appropriations bill in FY 2001. One was the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program, which provided, which actually was permanent, change or amendment to the Pittman-Robertson Act, $50 million. And then the State Wildlife Grants Program at $50 million that was through a different appropriation bill. So in that first year in 2001, there was actually $100 million to support state-based fish and wildlife conservation. That then, the State Wildlife Grant Program was nationally competitive the first year. There was sort of a decision to just make that program of the money available to states through apportionments, and wildlife conservation restoration wasn't funded again, but it's still on the books. And I bring that up because I'll touch on that when we get to Recovering America's Wildlife Act, because that is the fund within Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So then, as a requirement, state wildlife grants, and I'll get into this a little bit more, states had to agree to develop a state wildlife action plan. First generations of those were done in 2005. The second generation, there's a requirement to update those at least every 10 years in 2015, and then we're right on the cusp of the next generation of these plans being done in 2025. But I'll mention that there was actually in the 2000s, in two different Congresses, a bill called the Teaming with Wildlife Act that was introduced by Senator Johnson, Ron Johnson of South Dakota. He had sort of put it out there as sort of a marker bill. He was working on comprehensive energy legislation, was not able to get to that through the Senate. So the Teaming with Wildlife Act never really went anywhere. So there's a period of time where the states were churning away, implementing their state wildlife action plans. We were working on, trying to grow state and tribal wildlife grant funding, but weren't able to really achieve that. So in 2015, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies stood up the Blue Ribbon Panel on Sustaining America's Fish and Wildlife, and then that led to the introduction of the first iteration of Recovering America's Wildlife Act in 2016. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on Recovering America's Wildlife Act at the end of the PowerPoint. So I just wanted state wildlife grants. So the connection between wildlife action plans and state wildlife grants, if a state would like to receive apportionment funding through the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program, they must commit to developing and implementing a state wildlife action plan. In fact, all of the funding from this program must go towards implementing or developing a state wildlife action plan. And as you can see, we went from 50 million to 85 million, probably in large part due to 9/11 and sort of the focus on homeland security. We took a cut, kind of grew a little bit. The program reached its peak in FY 2010, $90 million. In fact, in that year, the administration requested $115 million for the program. After the Great Recession, we saw about a third of the program was cut, and we've sort of just stayed flat with a little bit of increase over the years. And that's sort of where we are today. But still about over $1 billion has gone to state fish and wildlife agencies to conserve at-risk species, which sounds like a lot, but when you divide that amongst 56 states, territories, and District of Columbia, and then there's also a portion for tribes, it's less than $1 million per jurisdiction to conserve essentially the biodiversity of their state. So in that context, it's not nearly enough, and that's why we need all of you to really help us get Recovering America's Wildlife across the finish line. So again, there's a requirement. If you want to receive state wildlife grants, you have to develop a state wildlife action plan and implement it. There's actually was a requirement under state wildlife grants and under the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program, and the service sort of melded that requirement together into the requirement for a state wildlife action plan. But this was truly historic when this happened. Never in the history of conservation had we had sort of coast-to-coast planning, comprehensive planning for fish and wildlife. And it was a big undertaking. These states had very small staffs. AFWA worked to develop guidance with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but it was a major undertaking to get these plans done. And it was really important that states were given a lot of latitude in how they developed a plan to help conserve the fish and wildlife in their state. I'm going to walk through the 8 required elements. Each of these plans, Congress required or laid out 8 elements that have to be included in these plans. These plans are approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I want to underscore, these are not plans for state fish and wildlife agencies. That was not the intent. They are plans for each state that lays out what needs to be done to conserve the majority of the biodiversity in those states. They really are the blueprints for conservation, for fish and wildlife conservation. So I'm just going to walk through these 8 elements. I'll try not to go into too much detail, but I want you to sort of have an understanding of what makes these plans tick. Sort of foundational to state wildlife action plans are the species of greatest conservation need list. So each state is required to sort of look at their state, use whatever data is available, and do an assessment of how the species that sort of represent the biodiversity of the state are doing. And it's important that it's not just species that are not hunted. Congress specifically said that, these plans are really to lay out, sort of catalog the diversity of species that contribute to the health of fish and wildlife. And it can include both species that are hunted and not fished, and fished, and species that are and species that aren't. Across the states and territories, there's 12,000 plus species of greatest conservation need. I say 12,000 plus because we don't really have a precise number. There's some taxonomic inconsistencies that we're working on that make it hard to kind of get to one number, but it's clearly over 12,000 species. We're really fortunate that the U.S. Geological Survey maintains a database of all the species of greatest conservation need that you can search by year, by taxonomic group, by taxonomic rate, by state. And it's a really important tool for conservationists that are looking at doing work interjurisdictionally or across larger landscapes. We're working with USGS and the National Wildlife Federation on a project to help clear up some of those inconsistencies and sort of create a new tool that states can use to catalog the SGCN data and send it over to USGS. We want to get this new information in here when the 2025 revision is done. And we're thinking of other ways to really make this a more useful tool for the conservation community. Number two, so key habitats. So the states were required to identify the habitats that are critical to the conservation of species of greatest conservation need. Include information, on the condition of those habitats. And although there was no requirement that states develop a geospatial map to kind of show where the most important places in the state are for conservation, almost every state has done this. And this is an example of Missouri's, and in most states they're called conservation opportunity area maps. But this is intended to, well, it's based on really good science, and Missouri has probably, compared to some states, some of the best data available. They can identify the landscapes that need to be conserved in order to conserve most of the biodiversity in the state. And when I say conserved, I don't necessarily mean protection. It might be stepped up management, it might be stepped up inventory, or it might be protection. But this is the map in Missouri of if you want to do conservation work that makes that matters to biodiversity, these shaded areas are the place where the State Wildlife Action Plan in Missouri tells you to work. And what's I think really interesting about Missouri is they have tiers. And so the red tier are those places that are the extreme most important places to work to conserve fish and wildlife. Tier 2, the orange is, those are also priorities. These are all priorities, but it's sort of tiered so that if there's limited resources, the agency and their partners really know where to go work first in the state. So the third element, key threats. So states are required to identify the threats to those species of greatest conservation need and their habitats. Everything from invasive species to climate change to direct loss of habitat, sea level rise. Those are all the types of threats that you'll see in these plans. And we did look at after the first iteration plan, sort of looked at what were some of the top threats. And I think at the time, invasive species were right amongst the top threats for species of greatest conservation need. And then along with that, conservation actions. What are the actions that states need to take to overcome the threats to benefit species of greatest conservation need in their habitats? So it includes, things like reintroduction of species, habitat management, research is often, and monitoring are often actions that you'll see in these plans, and land protection, obviously, too, is an important action. And then element 5, each state's required to put together a plan for monitoring species and for monitoring the effectiveness of the actions that are taken in those plans. Element 6, so each state must commit to a comprehensive review every 10 years. So the vast majority of states are working on this major revision right now, and that'll come due October 2025. There's other types of reviews, but the comprehensive review must be done no less than every 10 years. And states have to sort of identify in their state wildlife action plan when that next review is going to happen. And then coordination. So these plans require states to work with other agencies, including state and federal, with tribes, and with other groups that either have significant land holdings in the state or have programs that can significantly impact biodiversity. So you'll see states reach out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Geological Survey, tribes, local land trusts to help ensure that they've got the best conservationists minds at the table when they're developing the plans, and also to help ensure awareness so that these entities can make use of the plan once they're completed. And then finally, there's a public participation component where states are required to make these plans available to the public for review. And some states have steering committees that include, partners and members of the public. All states have some type of review process where they'll send the plan out and ask the public to comment, and then they'll incorporate those comments into the plan. So, really important to this is how we message state wildlife action plans, and they were originally called Comprehensive Wildlife Conservation Strategies or Comprehensive Wildlife Conservation plans. And really a lot of credit to Naomi Edelson when she was at AFWA. She did some fundraising and was able to hire a bipartisan polling firm that took those words, comprehensive wildlife conservation strategy, and tested them, and then looked for alternative words. And what we found out that comprehensive wildlife conservation strategy meant little to members of the public and often meant little to partners. And so the words that really, through the polling, that really resonated were action, were state wildlife plan. So we rebranded these comprehensive wildlife conservation strategies as state wildlife action plans. And as part of that process, and through some polling, we identified how to message, how to talk about these plans, and it resulted in what's called the message triangle. So if you go up to the left part of the screen, the state wildlife action plans, they conserve wildlife, they conserve natural places to enhance our own quality of life. Move to the right, they support and benefit the health of wildlife and people. Really critical that we bring people into this. We're doing this work not just for wildlife, for the sake of conserving wildlife, but for the sake of people. And then, sort of this other angle as we're a growing nation, as we develop more land for people to live, that we have a responsibility that we need to conserve wildlife so that future generations can enjoy that wildlife much like we did. So it's sort of when it's really laid out. So when you're talking to media or talking to partners, help people understand that these plans benefit both human and wildlife. It's an investment for future generations to benefit. And then this idea of being cost effective. And I really think they are cost effective plans. The states are doing a ton of work on with not a lot of resources. We need them to do a lot more work if we can give them more resources, both states and their partners. So just to sort of run through, there's three revision types. The comprehensive is the full review of the plan. There's a major, which if you're just looking at reviewing one of the elements, and a minor review if you're just like changing the map of a distribution of a species, which doesn't require any consultation with the regional review team. AFWA and the Fish and Wildlife Service have developed guidance to help states with this. And then now the original plans had what was called a national acceptance team that was made up of the national board of folks that looked at the plans and approved them. We now have regional review teams. So each Fish and Wildlife Service region and each association of Fish and Wildlife Agency region, there's 4 of them in the Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and West, put together a team of folks that review these plans. So it's somebody from a state, not the state that the plan is from, and somebody from the Fish and Wildlife Service that makes the recommendation, reviews these plans. And sometimes these plans are north of 1,000, 1,200 pages. Very technical, lots of data, lots of information. So it's no small task to review these plans and make sure that they are fulfilling the requirements of the 8 required elements. They are all approved by the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I think that's really important to show that, we have the leading federal agency on fish and wildlife management is involved in this process. But one of the things we've learned over the years are these highly technical, very large documents aren't very accessible to partners and to even biologists that work within agencies. So we've been working the last couple of years in developing some guidance that states can use if they would choose to develop their State Wildlife Action Plan in a digital format. And we're developing a roadmap template for that. And what we're hoping is that we can streamline the review process for those states that choose this digital swap avenue. They can maybe fit all of their information in this template. And instead of looking at a 1,500-page plan, the review team might be able to look at 20 pages of information that's really relevant to making an assessment of whether the required element was met. So we're really excited that that's going to really trim down this review process. And concurrently with that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is developing a prototype dashboard that states can use to put the swap information into and make that State Wildlife Action Plan more accessible to partners and others, and help states that want to web enable their swap. And so what does that mean? So we have states that, and Oregon has really been in the forefront of this, that have taken their State Wildlife Action Plan and put it completely online. So it's searchable, it's beautiful pictures, it details the species of greatest conservation need and the habitats, the threats and actions, and monitoring. The whole plan is pretty much self-contained within a very dynamic website. And one of the things that they've been able to do is they now have analytics where they can tell who's using this plan, who's going out there and gathering information, or sometimes which parts of the plan don't really seem to resonate, or which actions don't really resonate with the public. So they're really able now, as they revise their plan, they can think about how to make their plan better. And then just a couple more slides. One of the things we've been working on for a couple of years at AFWA. So these plans, do a great job of identifying the issues in the state, the species in the state that need help. But we all know that species go across boundaries, particularly geographic or political boundaries. And so how can we take these individual swaps and sort of glue them together so that they can be used at more of a landscape scale? And I have to give hats off to Becky's region in the Northeast. They really started this kind of thought process 20 years ago at the very beginning of State Wildlife Action Plans, and where the Northeast almost sort of is like a regional plan in a sense for identifying and priorities and doing conservation work. But we have 3 what we call conservation blueprints. This is the Midwest, the example in the Midwest Landscape Initiative. There's a landscape design in the Northeast called Nature's Network, which is going under some rebranding, and Becky's actually involved in that process. When that Nature's Network was put together, it used the information, the swaps, to a large extent. And then in the Southeast, the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. So those 3 regions have these blueprints, which is led by the Fish and Wildlife Service with the states in those regions. And I think this is really the future of swaps. And I wanted to pull out the Midwest Landscape Initiative because they use species of greatest conservation need as one of their environmental indicators. And you can even toggle on and off these conservation opportunity areas that are part of each of these State Wildlife Action Plans. So, I'm hoping that some of the other regions sort of follow suit and really try to use these blueprints as a way to help elevate state wildlife action plans and use that data within state wildlife action plans. And so I don't have much time to tell all the great stories about state, that state wildlife grants have achieved. We have a great report out there that we did with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Wildlife Federation, Wildlife Society, American Fisheries Society. We put together a report, gave each state an opportunity to sort of tell 3 stories about how they've been able to improve the status of species of greatest conservation need. And I have lots of hard copies of these available in the AFWA office. I think it's a great leave behind it for Hill offices. So just let Kurt or I know if you need some copies of this report. Fortunately, we printed it out during the middle of COVID, so we weren't able to do a lot of outreach on the Hill at the time, but I think it's still a very relevant resource. And I wanted to just post up a box. This is taken from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service budget justification from FY 2025 for state and tribal wildlife grants. So we continue to see that the program is meeting its purpose. It is preventing listing. The data often that states collect using funding from state and tribal wildlife grants identified in state wildlife action plans is the data that the Fish and Wildlife Service can use to say that that listing for a species is not warranted. But it's also the work that's happening on the ground is leading to delisting, recovery of ESA species. We just need to scale this up. If you think about it, it's less than $1 million on average to each of these jurisdictions. It does not go very far, but we're still showing progress. I think we've been able to show the proof here that this will work. If it's scaled up, we'll be able to be a lot more successful in preventing biodiversity loss. And finally, I just wanted to mention the Blue Ribbon Panel. So again, out of sort of a frustration back in the 2010s that we just weren't making any legislative progress. I think Nick Wiley's on the phone. He was involved in this during his tenure as president of AFWA. We pulled together a Blue Ribbon Panel. And when we thought about it, it's like, well, we could just bring the conservation groups together and figure out what needs to be done. Instead, we invited industry, we invited conservation groups that focus on game species. We brought in conservation groups that focus on non-game species. We brought in some academics. And it was a really cool effort to see 26 leaders within industry and conservation really get their brains around what's happening. Biodiversity loss was evident even in 2016, and they said, we have to do something. We have, and the best thing we can do is just put money into implementing these state wildlife action plans. And so the $1.3 billion annually came from a survey that AFWA contracted Southwick and Associates, a natural resource economist, and asked them to survey each state and find out what it would take to put those, to fully implement those state wildlife action plans. And so that was $1.3 billion per year and sustained funding in order to get these plans fully implemented and meet the goal of reducing endangered species, of restoring endangered species that are already endangered, and really creating a future for wildlife that's going to benefit future generations. And so, and I wanted to just mention, so that was sort of the main recommendation, and it calls for the money to go into this existing account under Pittman-Robertson called the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program. And the interesting thing about that is that account sort of has 3 pillars to it, which I think going back to the 70s was thought as the 3 basic needs we need to do. States need money for wildlife conservation, but they also need funding for conservation education. We need to do a better job of educating folks of the importance of these species and their losses. And then wildlife dependent recreation. We also need more people out enjoying nature and getting outside and enjoying wildlife through viewing in order to be successful. So That's the three pillars that are part of the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program. But the second recommendation, Steve Kellert, some of you may know the name, a social scientist from Yale, was on the Blue Ribbon panel. And from the very first day, he said, it's not just the money. It's a sort of a chicken and egg thing, that these state agencies have to show that they're relevant in order to get the funding. And so Steve recommended or convinced the Blue Ribbon panel to make a second recommendation, which was to sort of think about and do some, make some recommendations on how Fish and Wildlife agencies, state Fish and Wildlife agencies, can become more relevant to more people. And that resulted in an effort to develop a roadmap on relevancy that's being used by many states to sort of attack this issue of, we're more than just, hunters and anglers are super important to our agencies, but we need to reach out more broadly than that and bring in some of the folks that care about fish and wildlife, but maybe are not currently and probably never will be hunters and anglers. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to turn it over to Becky. And you've got plenty of time, Becky, to just give your perspective from doing this for so long in the great state of Virginia.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you this afternoon. And I will try to keep my comments short because I know you want to have some time to talk about your next steps and policy questions. But I think there might be some value that, while I recognize several names in the group on the call today who've been in this as long or longer than I have, I want to make sure that you have some state perspective to complement what Mark's just presented about the value of state wildlife action plans, what they mean for fish and wildlife conservation at the state level, some challenges that we faced, and why, from our perspective, Recovering America's Wildlife Act is such a game changer. So Mark mentioned that I've been involved in our state wildlife action plan work since the very inception. So in 2021, when the directives first came as part of that state and tribal wildlife grants appropriation, I led the team in Virginia that developed our first wildlife action plan. And the revisions that have followed since then really have continued to refine and improve what we are delivering. And it's really given us a springboard and a platform to galvanize what I'm going to call the very broadest conservation tangential communities, from those organizations that are all in, like Ducks Unlimited and our National Wild Turkey Federation, to the State Ornithological Society and American Bird Conservancy, but also those entities that are interested in the development of ecotourism, other opportunities, and the conservation education and STEM-related work that's going on across the country. We now have this platform to talk about wildlife at the state level, and not just some wildlife, but all the wildlife. And the ability to help those partners really see and recognize that what they have in common, especially when we start talking about the importance of habitats, really is significant versus the things that they might disagree or have differences about. And that really, ultimately, at the end of the day, the implementation of the Wildlife Action Plan of Virginia is about an all wildlife benefit mindset. We have been successful in the state in leveraging this into programs that other agencies run. There are at least 4 different land acquisition grant programs that the state administers, where I have managed to shoehorn the Wildlife Action Plan, species of greatest conservation need, and the habitats that support them as elemental scoring metrics as part of those proposal evaluations. So projects come in and get a decent number of points for any nexus that there might be with state species of greatest conservation need and their habitats. So from my perspective, that's a value add. It's also been really a driver with a number of our conservation organizations. Finally, and I want to say finally, this is just within the last 5 years or so, picking up the flag with DWR and several other conservation partners to advocate for funding to support freshwater mussel conservation and restoration in Virginia. In the southwest part of Virginia, the Upper Tennessee River system, we have an abundance of highly imperiled freshwater mussels, largely the result of the series of dams implemented by the Tennessee Valley Authority. And now we have money through a general fund appropriation in Virginia, which is novel for our agency, not only to support 2 full-time assistant malacologist positions, but the development of a statewide mussel conservation plan and funding to help with some of our facility improvement work. The Wildlife Action Plan has given us a springboard from which, in partnership with Virginia Tech, we have now an NSF grant and a private foundation funding work on hellbender conservation in the Commonwealth. And these are really huge examples where the plan has been elemental in giving people a springboard to say, we need your money to contribute to this conservation work. That's not to say that this has all been without any kind of challenge. The development of plans has evolved over time, I will say, as the practitioner for the last couple of decades. Getting people to the table early on was challenging because they didn't see how they might fit in here. There was perceptions that this was about non-game species only, to Mark's point about this being, any species that may be in decline. We have a number of waterfowl species, some upland game birds, some fur-bearing mammals on our list of SGCN here in Virginia. But it was hard to get those people to the table because they felt like it was perhaps a trajectory towards at least state listing. And so we have really worked over time to ensure that we have continued to practice and preach this as non-regulatory. This is really a blueprint, and we want people to find themselves in it for those species and habitats for which they're passionate, because I'm sure that there is something in there for everyone. But we had few experts that really could come to the table and inform our decision making. Lots of species like freshwater mussels, like reptiles and amphibians, we don't have current good status and distribution information for, which was kind of an anomaly for the people who live in the game, wildlife, and sportfish worlds, where there are regular, almost always annual surveys about how those species are doing across our landscape. So we're really starting from different platforms, and our abilities to identify threats to those resources and the conservation actions that would address them is predicated on really having a good understanding and handle on where the species actually occur on the landscape and how they're faring in those areas. And so we've needed to do some really what I would call basic natural history work that was important, but not the most sexy things that you could be asking for. In implementation, I suspect that any of the participants on the call that have been involved in their action plans will agree that the 2 challenges really in implementation have been about capacity and having the resources to do the really scaled up work. I mentioned some freshwater mussel conservation work that we're doing in Virginia. We have a facility that is almost a little hut on the backside of one of our fish hatcheries, where we are doing internationally recognized work to conserve highly imperiled species in Virginia, from propagation to restoration, serving as an ARC destination for those species that are so at risk and imperiled in the natural environment that we've taken individuals out of the natural systems to protect them from any kind of catastrophic event that might impact the waters they're found in. But it's a ramshackled hut, and we're at the place where we have capacity limitations about how many animals we can propagate and how long we can hold them in captivity before we place them in the wild, where we can increase their survivability potential. I'm confident all of you have had experiences with BIL and IRA funding sources that are out there. At TWR, we've been really challenged to capitalize on those because our capacity limitations have made it difficult for us to have shovel-ready projects. And so the ability to be in a proactive mode and planning for projects would have positioned us much better to be ready to apply for these funds. And I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's hard to compete for those funds when you're still at I'm trying to figure out where all these animals are and what the right conservation action is to do. But from our perspective, as we think about how Recovering America's Wildlife Act could really be a game changer here in Virginia. So our agency budget is about $72 million. We currently get $1 million through state wildlife grants. Virginia's allocation or apportionment under the most recent formulas that I've seen would be about $22 million. So almost a 25% or 30% increase in our budget. Totally game changing. And the things that we've thought about, I mean, we are not able to improve this mussel conservation facility that we have because it's a $10 to $12 million renovation. We have no capacity to generate that kind of money. We have law enforcement officers participating in covert operations to address poaching and the illegal trade of turtles in Virginia, which if you look across the landscape is likely tied with, if not ahead of, habitat loss for turtles across the country, particularly in the Northeast region. And we don't really have any ability to continue that in a long-term basis because of the funding streams that we have that support our law enforcement officers. And we certainly don't have capacity to expand that work, but it is vital to the conservation and protection of our turtles in Virginia. Our hatcheries have every ability to produce our SGCN fish because they excel at animal husbandry, but they need facility upgrades, some biosecurity protocols implemented that would enable them to do that. Again, don't have the work, don't have the funding to support that right now. We have, as part of the Chesapeake Bay Partnership and Alliance, a strong directive, target, and commitment towards wetland restoration and enhancement, particularly in the central part of the Chesapeake Bay estuary. Our wetlands are going underwater faster than anybody else's in the entire East Coast. And we are shoestringing this together with little bits of funding here, there, and everywhere. A couple of sort of other novel things that we've thought about, because this is not just about how DWR could spend the money, but thinking about a grants program to local governments and non-governmental organizations that would partner in habitat enhancement and restoration. So force multiplying other people's abilities to do great work on the ground. And maybe even more novel, a local ecotourism grant that would be focused on highlighting, interpreting, and promoting species of greatest conservation need, the habitats that support them, engaging communities in wildlife viewing experiences, and to a point that Mark made, really helping grow not only the people who know about our agency, but support its work, ultimately increasing our relevancy. So I have a lot more on my sheet, but I'm going to stop there just in the interest of your time today, and happy to engage with any of you outside of this conversation as well. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thank you for that, Becky. Becky really is one of the leaders nationally on both development, implementation, and thinking about how these wildlife action plans can conserve fish and wildlife. So we'd be happy to take any questions that you have. And if we don't have answers, we'll promise to get them to you. Are there any questions?
Mark, are you pausing for questions now, or are we at the end and can ask any question?
Yeah, absolutely. Fire away.
As many states are doing their next review, 10-year review of the plans, should environmental groups, advocacy, and other groups think of that as sort of we should just let you go about your business, or is there some role to play in, I don't even know what it would be, but it strikes me that it would be mostly, I think let state agencies do their thing, but I'm curious if there's any role to play for us.
Yeah, thank you for that, Steve. And it's, it varies from state to state. And some states, there's partner meetings that are held around each state to just bring in the input. There's lots of good ideas. environmental groups sometimes have data that states can use. So I would say, reach out to the coordinator in your state or states and ask them, can I get involved? Is there something I can contribute? I don't think there's many states that wouldn't welcome an opportunity to bring in more partners to this effort.
Mark, if I can just follow up on that then as well. I think that was a perfect response to Steve's question at the state level. Steve, I think as you've been part of some of the conversations we've been having as well, we've also been talking about how can we raise awareness on the Hill as well, that this whole process is kicking off and this is a really big year. So it's one thing to be aware, it's another thing to kind of have ownership and a better understanding. So we're also having a conversation yet this month and hopefully planning for yet this Congress to have a briefing on the Hill to do something similar, kind of demystify the acronyms that everybody seems to be generally supportive of and as an engine to continue to support efforts to get funding.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Is the slideshow available? I took some notes, but would love to have it review.
Yeah, absolutely. We can make that available.
Mark, I was just wondering if there's a place for us to go that might give us some insight into those efforts that were not successful so that we can learn from the lessons of others with initiatives that didn't reach their goals.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we want to learn from mistakes. They're the best places to learn sometimes. And I don't know if I have a specific answer, although this group of folks out there that do state wildlife action plans, I work with them that either on the planning and or implementation, they are a younger generation often that they are probably more in tune of looking for those failures from their colleagues and learning from them. And, the edge of innovation is failure, right? We learn, we do something, we fail, we learn from it, we do better. And I think that is part of this culture of these younger folks, because, now they have programs. It was different back, 20 years ago when many states had very little, no programs at all. I like to say there's one state that actually to get the match for their state wildlife grants had to put out an annual appeal to people in their state. And they were very successful at it, but there was just no money coming from the legislature to support this work. So I think there's, lots of places we can learn from, because this type of work is all experimental in some cases when you're doing reintroductions or habitat management, and it's such a shifting, changing environment that we always are going to have to adapt. But I will keep that in mind, and I'll do some probing to see, if there is some formalized effort to sort of learn from our mistakes.
Thank you.
Brent?
Hey, Mark, thanks. I wonder what's ongoing and what could be increased in terms of kind of corporate engagement on this side. I'm the director of sustainability partnerships with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, and there's so much interest in investment on carbon and climate, but biodiversity is another key thing waiting in the wings of corporate commitments. And this whole framework is just really well presented to find opportunities to show corporate investment and commitment, to leverage match, and to target those right species that are overlooked, but they're not as sensitive and concerned, as sometimes businesses can be on the other end of the spectrum. So what's being done there, and how can we help to keep engaging there and getting support from that realm?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And we'll take any help we can get. I think, these swaps, I sit in meetings sometimes where the conversation is about biodiversity conservation, and I kind of sit back and swaps are just not mentioned. It's still sort of off the screen. I think that's a little bit to do, and maybe Becky can speak to this. The culture of these folks that work at state fish and wildlife agencies is they put their nose to the grindstone. They go from project to project to project, don't have the luxury of going out and kind of tooting their own horn. And in some cases, you know, working for a state government, it's difficult maybe to go out and reach out to a potential corporate partner. There might be some restrictions to doing that, or it might just not be time. But anything you can do, Brent, or anyone else in this call to, you know, help connect these corporate partners that want to do something for biodiversity. Boy, this is wrapped up in a bow. The states just need resources to put this work on the ground. Did you want to add anything, Becky?
No, I would agree with what you said, which is, you know, when we finish something, we have checked the box, we move on to the next fire that's burning on the desk, or in the field, literally. And we do have some pretty tight walls around our abilities to engage with the corporate environment, because we may or may not be dialed into some of the political sensitivities that might be occurring with our state administration versus the politics of a particular corporation, you know, whether that should be influential on this particular discussion. I'm not going to speak to that, but I mean, that's just the reality of the world that we play in, is sort of not exacerbated, you know, just sort of through the lens of political landscapes as well.
Thank you for that, Becky. Robert?
I just want to thank you so much for pulling this together. I've been advocating for Recovering America's Wildlife Act for the past 5 years, and I really appreciate the deep dive today. I also wanted to say that I believe that there's another kind of similar to what Brent was just saying. There's a whole nother push these days for things called nature-based solutions, nature-based climate solutions. I think that the overlap between the two of these things is critical. This provides so much in the roadmap that you put together, so much more information about how to do good nature projects that can also help on climate. So this information, these wildlife action plans, provide so much information for us to be able to utilize in other locations. So I think it's a great program. I'm happy to hear as much work has gone on with it. I used to work at DEP in Connecticut for a long time, and the dedication of the staff and folks who work in these areas is unprecedented in my mind. People are unbelievable. And I think it's just great that we're doing this work, and we're going to continue to push for Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I just want to thank you for doing this. Really exciting. It was really helpful for me to learn a lot about it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Robert, and thank you for your support of Recover America's Wildlife Act. And we talk about nature-based solutions. It's sort of a new concept I'm learning within a lot of states. And so we do a monthly, we call it the SWAP Learning Series, and we bring these new ideas from, you know, that we're hearing in DC or in other parts of the country. And it's really that opportunity for all the states to get on that phone together, or on that in that webinar together, and talk through some of these things. And you know, Jason Goldberg, who helps me with those SWAP Learning Series, this is one of the topics that we've thought about for a future learning series.
I'll throw in the chat if I can find it. Massachusetts recently did an executive order in this space. I'll see if I can't find it and throw it in the chat real quick.
Yeah, they were the first. The governor has sort of issued a proclamation to, and that's a good example where the governor said, I want to do something for biodiversity, and I want to set goals for biodiversity conservation. But out of the box, the governor didn't really know about the State Wildlife Action Plan in Massachusetts. So there's a little bit of catch up there. Eve Schluter, the deputy in Massachusetts, sort of got tasked with working with the governor's office, and now they've sort of integrated their biomap and their State Wildlife Action Plan with the goals of the governor. And it actually really sped up the process, because a lot of this thinking and monitoring has already been done. Larry?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear you say this, Mark, and maybe I misunderstood that it's not owned by the state wildlife, Fish and Wildlife, the SWAP. And here in Montana, that's not at all the case. I mean, they're running the whole show. I don't even think of U.S. Fish and Wildlife being involved in any way. So maybe I misunderstood what you meant.
Well, there's variation. Each state sort of has to, you know, do this within their own constraints and policies. But the intent of Congress was, the state is the lead, the State Fish and Wildlife Agency is the lead in developing these plans. But, you know, if you look through the 8 elements, particularly the one on coordination and public input, they're intended to involve, you know, others within the state that can help put this together. And I think the vast majority of states, they will take all the help they can get to develop and implement these plans, understanding that at the end of the day, that state agency is responsible for the content of that plan. So they have to make some decisions on, you know, if there's the science, you know, that's coming in from one part and it may be different from their own or from another part. They have to make those decisions. But these are, from what I've seen, the intention is this is our best hope to conserve the biodiversity in the state. My agency can't do it alone. I need help. And even with RAWA, I think that will still apply. It's such a big undertaking that I think most states are welcome to have partner support.
And one more thing, you did mention the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a stake in this, has a approval sort of. I wasn't aware of that, so that was new information for me.
And they approve every state wildlife grant. There's sort of, you know, like 5 levels of accountability, you know, that you don't really see in any other conservation grant program. And the same would be true with Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This is a very rigorously accountable program. And this Fish and Wildlife Service is a very, very important partner. And I think I mentioned, you know, this dashboard for SWAPs, that's being developed by Science Applications within Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of this work that's been done, you know, whether it's the 20th anniversary report, which Paul Van Ryzen helped to spearhead, it's done in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, I think maybe Kurt, I'll turn it over to you if there's anything you want to share about recovering or anything else we can discuss. Feel free.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mark. And I want to be sensitive of everyone's time, so I'll keep it short, but just appreciate everyone's participation today. I think one of the things that became very clear, you know, certainly over the last year, is what we've been hearing on the Hill continues to be, and I think you heard this from Sean previously, Sean Seville, there is strong support for the concepts of species of greatest conservation need, state-led conservation, the importance of supplying funding for both states and tribes for them to meet the needs to address species of conservation need and the State Wildlife Action Plan. So this is, I think, an attempt, hopefully, to bring everybody up to speed on just a little bit more information about what that entails. That was today's intent. Like I'd said earlier, we're also looking to engage the Hill a bit more, given the attention to a species of greatest conservation need and SWAPs. So be on the lookout for something yet. I think we're looking at the September timeframe when we do something similar. We continue to remain engaged with our Senate champions, Senators Heinrich and Senator Tillis, in regards to Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And, you know, it's something that we're going to continue to lean into along with the Alliance and the partnership. And I think just looking to be strategic here going forward for the remainder of this Congress. None of this is wasted, because it's also going to, if necessary, help build momentum into the next Congress as well. So that remains our focus. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up with myself, David Lind, or any of the other government affairs folks that are on line here. We still check in regularly and try to stay coordinated in our efforts to get this done and get the funding that's needed to do this important work. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you, everyone. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any more questions about state wildlife action plans or state and tribal wildlife grants. Okay. Have a great day, everyone.